Good night, this is Fumi Sleepy Time Stories. Tonight's bedtime story is about to begin.
Once upon a time, there was a wealthy farmer whose riches could fill wagons and whose lands stretched across the countryside. Yet in his otherwise perfect life, there was one great sorrow: he had no children. Whenever he went into town, other farmers would mock him, asking why he had no heir. At last, unable to endure the ridicule any longer, he returned home in a fury and cried out, "I must have a child, even if it's a hedgehog." And so it happened, his wife gave birth to a strange creature with the upper body of a hedgehog and the lower body of a boy. She was terrified and blamed her husband, saying, "Look what misfortune your foolish wish has brought upon us." But the farmer sighed, "What's done is done. We must have him baptized, but who will be his godfather? Let's call him Hans the Hedgehog," his wife replied. After the christening, the pastor said, "He is covered in spines. He cannot sleep in a regular bed." So they laid hay behind the stove, and Hans the Hedgehog slept there. His mother couldn't nurse him, for his spines pricked her terribly. And so he lay behind the stove for 8 years. His father grew tired of him and thought to himself he'd be better off dead. But Hans lived on stubbornly. One day, the farmer prepared to go to the market and asked what he should bring back. His wife asked for some meat and white bread. The maid requested a pair of slippers and some embroidered stockings. Finally, he asked Hans, "And what about you, my little hedgehog?" Hans replied, "Dear father, bring me a bagpipe." When the farmer returned, he brought meat and bread for his wife, slippers and stockings for the maid, and a bagpipe for Hans. Hans took the bagpipe and said, "Dear father, please go to the blacksmith and have horseshoes made for my rooster. I shall ride him away, never to return." The farmer, secretly delighted, did just as he was asked. Hans mounted his rooster, took along some pigs and donkeys, and rode off into the forest. High into the trees he flew, and there he stayed for many years, tending his animals and playing beautiful tunes on his bagpipe. His father heard nothing of him again. One day, a king who had lost his way passed near the forest and was amazed to hear music floating through the trees. He sent a servant to find the source, who discovered Hans atop a tree, playing his bagpipe while sitting on a rooster. The king ordered the servant to ask Hans for directions back to the kingdom. Hans agreed, but only if the king promised in writing to give him the first thing he saw upon returning to his palace. The king, thinking Hans could not read, agreed, and signed a promise. When he reached home safely, the first to greet him was his daughter, who ran to embrace him. The king suddenly remembered Hans and explained everything. "But I tricked him," he said, "and wrote that he would receive nothing." The princess praised his cleverness, for she never wished to live with a hedgehog. Meanwhile, Hans tended his animals cheerfully, his forest now so full of pigs that he decided to return to the village. He sent word to his father to clear all the pigsties and gather the butchers, for he was bringing back a great herd. The father was ashamed, having believed Hans long dead. Hans rode in on his rooster, and at his command, the butchering began. The sound of it echoed for miles. When it was done, Hans said, "Father, take my rooster to the smith again. This time I'm leaving for good." His father complied, secretly relieved. Hans rode on to the first kingdom. There, the king had ordered everyone to shoot or drive off anyone riding a rooster and playing bagpipes. But when Hans arrived, he tapped his spurs, and the rooster flew over the gates and landed on the king's windowsill. Hans shouted that the king must fulfill his promise or face death. Terrified, the king begged his daughter to go with Hans. She was dressed in white and sent off in a grand carriage with gold, jewels, and maids. Hans sat beside her, bagpipe in hand. But once they had left the city, Hans tore her fine clothes from her, pricked her until she bled, and cried, "This is your punishment for your father's lies and your scorn." Then he sent her back in disgrace, and no one ever respected her again. Hans then rode to the second kingdom. This king had commanded that if anyone saw the hedgehog riding a rooster, they must greet him with honor and lead him to the palace. When the princess saw him, she was frightened by his strange form, but remembered her promise to her father. She came out to meet Hans and accepted him as her husband. At the feast, they sat side by side at the royal table. That night, though afraid of his spines, she followed him to their chamber. Hans reassured her and told the old king to place 4 guards outside the door and light a fire. Before entering the bed, he would shed his hedgehog skin and throw it beside the bed. The guards must then toss it into the fire and not leave until it burned to ash dot at the stroke of 11. Hans entered, slipped off his hedgehog skin, and tossed it to the floor. The guards sprang forth and threw it into the fire. As it burned, Hans was freed, his body dark as soot, but human at last. The royal doctor treated him with rare salves until his skin became white and smooth. He was now a handsome young man. The princess was overjoyed. The next morning, they awoke happily, celebrated their marriage anew, and Hans inherited the throne. Years later, Hans returned with his queen to visit his father. But the old man insisted he had no son, only a creature born like a hedgehog who vanished long ago. Hans proved who he was, and the farmer was overjoyed. He followed his son back to the Grand Kingdom, where Hans now reigned as king.
The end.